Penguin Random House Audio presents The New York Times Book Review, 125 Years of Literary History. Edited by Tina Jordan with Nora Kassim. Read for you by Vikas Adam, Scott Brick, Jericho Brown, Ron Butler, Theodore Chin, Sloane Crosley, Michael Crouch, Alma Cuervo, Jonathan Davis, Junot Diaz, Roxane Gay, Dominic Hoffman, Hilary Huber, Dr. Tayari Jones, Eva Kaminsky, January Lavoie, Rebecca Lohman, Arthur Morey, Robin Miles, Sonila Nankani, Robert Petkoff, Jodi Picoult, Gary Shteyngart, Suzanne Torren, Sarah Weinman, Julia Whalen, and Jenna Wortham, with Tina Jordan.
For my mother, Marlis Anderson Jordan, who instilled in me a love of reading and ferried me to the Emily Fowler Public Library once a week for an armload of books when I was a kid. And in memory of my father, Terry Gilbert Jordan, a professor whose vibrant intellect and curiosity helped shape the way I read and think to this day. The birth of the book review. As we celebrate the 125th anniversary of the New York Times Book Review, take a trip with us back to the earliest years of the newspaper to look at how its literary coverage began and how it grew before being spun off into the book review we know today. It all started in the very first issue of the New York Daily Times on September 18, 1851. Peer carefully at the old yellowing pages, densely speckled with 6 columns of tiny, often smudged type, and there, in an article on page 2, headlined Snapshots at Books, Talk, and Town, the paper laid out its ambitious plans for covering books and the publishing industry. The bookmen are just now bidding upon the summer's surfeit of literature, and sometime it may be worth our while to take our readers into the rooms of this traffic, the newspaper announced. We shall sometimes, too, take note of the books of the day, unravel their narrative into a newspaper column, and give the public, whom we have taken in hand to serve, a running synopsis of their story. And if we give, now and then, a critical shot at their manner, method, or morals, we shall do it with all the modesty, and perhaps the occasional misses, which belong to our swift shooting. No time was wasted. The next day, the paper introduced a column about authors and artists called Limnings of Literary People. And on September 22nd, the first book reviews appeared. They included such gems as the United States Post Office Guide and an apparently execrable novel called Kenneth, A Romance of the Highlands, the review of which began, "Mr. Reynolds is a bad specimen of a very bad school of writers." Book reviews, which were published at least once a week, were crisp and to the point. D.J. Brown's American Muck book, for example, got a one-line rave as doubtless a most valuable aid to the farmer who admits science to the help of agriculture. 2 1851 novels that we now regard as important were not reviewed. Herman Melville's Moby Dick, which came out a few weeks after the Times began publishing, and Nathaniel Hawthorne's House of the Seven Gables, which had been published in the spring. The second half of the 19th century was filled with riches. There were literary giants and pygmies, too, upon the earth, wrote Francis Brown, who edited the book review from 1949 until 1971. It was the period of Trollope and Dickens and Thackeray, of Whitman, Longfellow, Tennyson, and Baudelaire, of Darwin and Huxley, of the Russians Turgenev, Dostoevsky, and Tolstoy. With a few notable exceptions, the paper covered every important book published during those decades. Villette, by Charlotte Bronte, was hailed as a first-class work. An unnamed critic struggled with Leaves of Grass, first calling Walt Whitman a literary fraud, and then confessing, "Still, this man has brave stuff in him." Since the greater portion of this review was written, we confess to having been attracted again and again to Leaves of Grass. Of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, the paper's unnamed critic wrote, "Shall we frankly declare that after the most deliberate consideration of Mr. Darwin's arguments, we remain unconvinced?" The blockbuster novels of the day were often first published in serial form, usually in magazines like Harper's and Scribner's, and the Times covered new chapters with fanfare. The first sheets of Bleak House, Dickens's new novel, have been received in advance of their publication in London for Harper's Magazine, the paper reported on March 16, 1852. They have the clear ring of the true metal. Although an editor once railed that a serial story has ever been our special detestation, we have a horror of anything published in parts, the Times nonetheless published some serials of its own, including Thomas Hardy's The Hand of Ethelberta. The Times' book coverage extended well beyond reviews and serials. Holiday gift guides, publishing news, literary scandals, poems, summer reading, and recommendations for children could all be found in the pages of the paper. In 1871, an editorial remonstrated against the moral depravity of flash literature. In 1875, a male author penned an essay about the difficulties of dressing his female characters. The opening line, "What shall I put on her head?" Dime novels, the pulpy westerns that were blamed for social ills, like comic books in the mid-20th century and violent video games today, figured in countless news stories. Charles Dickens, Mark Twain, and Walt Whitman were among the subjects of early author profiles, some reprinted from other newspapers and magazines, others written for the Times. When a correspondent visited Émile Zola in Paris in 1885, he found it not a luxurious apartment. Straight-backed chairs were arranged against the walls in gaunt precision. A spiritless attempt at a bric-a-brac collection was nailed to the walls, and a few vases, suggestive of a New York boarding house, adorned the mantelpiece. When a writer called on Alexandre Dumas' fils, he described the house, at number 98 Avenue du Villiers, as glaringly white, three-storied, with a capacious porte-cochere, which could hold half a dozen carriages and still not be uncomfortably crowded. Authors like Dickens, William Makepeace Thackeray, and Oscar Wilde were front-page news when they came to America on speaking tours. Sometimes the paper began covering their visits the moment they disembarked from the ship. Literary stories, great and small, were considered newsworthy. A letter of support Louisa May Alcott sent to the American Woman's Suffrage Association was reprinted in full, as was Twain's Remedy for a Cold. Plain gin was recommended, then gin and molasses, then gin and onions. I took all three. When Wilde fell victim to card cheats in New York, readers learned about it in a piece headlined, "Oscar Fleeced at Banco." Authors' marriages, illnesses, arrests, writing habits, children, money problems, and vacations were fodder for stories. So were their deaths. When beloved authors were dying, the Times issued deathbed updates, in Whitman's case, for months, that we would now find intrusive. Given the breadth and depth of literary coverage appearing throughout the paper in those early decades, it was perhaps no surprise that someone decided to corral all those stories and reviews into a dedicated book section. That someone was Adolph S. Oakes, who established the Book Review as a standalone supplement shortly after he became publisher of the paper in 1896. And thus was born the New York Times Book Review, a publication that over the course of its 125-year history has been known variously as the Saturday Review of Books and Art, the Sunday Book Review, the NYTBR, or, mostly internally, simply TBR. Not to be mistaken for the current acronym for To Be Read, though you can understand the confusion. In this publication was carried out an idea of the publisher of the Times that a newspaper book review should be a literary newspaper, treating newly published books as news and containing, besides other news, of literary happenings, Elmer Davis wrote in
Sample complete. Ready to continue?